Hey, everybody. I'm Leanne Langer. I'm OpenComp's Head of Customer Experience, and welcome to today's High Growth Matters Community AMA session. I am here with Julia Dow, OpenComp's VP of Compensation Services. It's great to have you here with us, Julia.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. As you can tell, folks, Julia and I are not on camera. We are dealing with some really fun internet challenges, which is, a common but undesirable piece of working remotely. But we are here today, and we've got the audio, so we're grateful for that. Before we jump into our AMA content for the day, though, I would love to let our community get to know you a bit, Julia. So would you mind sharing a bit about your background?
Yeah, of course. So I have spent most of my career in global compensation. I've done that in private companies that are PE-backed, public companies, and then, of course, moving into consulting where I've helped probably more than 100 companies at this point design scalable compensation frameworks. Whenever I was in-house, I was most recently at Visa running their market data and analytics efforts there. So got to see the big and the small from a company perspective.
You definitely have an amazing depth and breadth of experience, Julia. So really happy that you're here with us today to chat about our topic, which is how to conduct a pay equity audit. And for our community members, we're definitely going to get tactical here. The goal is that you all leave today with some specific next steps that you can take to be able to move the needle on internal pay equity at your companies. All right. So Julia, paying fairly for the work that each employee does and their contributions to the organization is extremely important. And pay equity is on the forefront of many founder, CEO, and heads of HR minds, especially as they grow and scale their companies. So can we start by talking a bit about the benefits of doing an internal pay equity audit?
Yeah, of course. So I think first and foremost, it's building that trust and that feeling that employees are being compensated fairly, right? That's ultimately what we strive for as employers, and making sure that employees feel like the value that they're delivering is being acknowledged and recognized equitably across people putting in the same effort or doing the same types of jobs. So that starts to build the trust, and with trust comes employee engagement, retention, all that fun stuff. But also it helps from a legal and risk perspective, right? We want to make sure that there aren't gaps in our processes, pay, et cetera, that might come back later and cause some things that you have to deal with as a company. And sometimes those things that you have to deal with are lawsuits at the extreme end, but otherwise generally just questions and corrective actions that you need to take. So really mitigating that by putting processes in place is going to benefit a company in many different ways.
Yeah, and I like what you said there, especially about trust, because for right or for wrong, so many employees, they don't believe that their companies have a compensation philosophy or methodology in place. They think maybe compensation decisions are made, poof, out of thin air. And so making sure that we can be more transparent about how we make compensation decisions and share with employees that there is a method to the madness really goes a long way in building that trust. So definitely agree that we have to make these proper comp decisions so that we can properly motivate as well as incentivize our team members. And like you said, paying fairly is just simply good business. So with that, how frequently should companies plan to evaluate their team for pay fairness?
Yeah, so most companies choose to do this annually just because they might be reviewing compensation annually. It goes along with their budgeting process for their fiscal year or for any comp increases that occur for the following fiscal year. So a lot of times it just makes sense to roll it into that process, and it allows you also that time to take any action that you need within whatever budget you're allotting for any pay increases. So you kind of have to do all of it in one fell swoop. But companies also try to evaluate it when they're doing maybe some mid-year adjustments, right? They might be doing an off-cycle adjustment or a mid-year mini comp cycle. And so some companies also take that as an opportunity to make sure that their decisions are equitable as well.
And like anything else, in order to do this pay equity audit, you need to be prepared, to get that done. So there's definitely some prep work involved. What needs to be in place before any audit can actually be run?
Yeah, so you want obviously really clean employee data, which can be a tall task for some companies, depending on their systems, their data intake processes, etc. So you want good compensation information, you want to make sure your job family matches, your leveling matches, your pay range matches are all in alignment and correct. And then you also want to make sure that, which is actually a lot harder than a lot of companies either realize or they don't necessarily think that they're going to need this until the day comes. But a lot of times you want that documentation that tells you why you might have had to make an exception or a decision on an employee to pay them differently than others in their role. Because you're going to have to typically track that down eventually. So having that all in line, or also making sure that you're documenting that ahead of time, is really, really critical.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about how good data is the foundation to all compensation decisions. If your data is off, you are making inaccurate assumptions, which will lead you to make inappropriate, or not competitive pay decisions. And so, data is really important there. And you also touched on something really interesting, but it's the documentation around the reason why. And I feel like a lot of organizations, they don't really know the narrative, and I like to call it the compensation story of their company or of individual team members, and simply because there really isn't a good way or place to track that information right now. And so, I firmly believe that if you can tell a story with an employee's compensation, it translates into telling the story of their career trajectory at the organization. And again, like that piece will go a long way in terms of building trust with the employees as well.
Yep, 100%.
So when we think about the buy-in or the process for pay equity, who actually owns this at an organization?
Well, ideally you want, ownership can be defined in different ways because I think companies own different parts of the process. But usually you want it initiated or the buy-in to come from the top in your leadership team. Hopefully they value that and they think, hey, we want to make sure that we're doing everything right. And so that buy-in comes from the top. That also allows budget to be secured for any type of changes that need to be made. And then of course HR kind of shepherds and runs the process. And then you're probably going to need managers involved to give some context for why certain pay decisions were made, and also any communication of changes in pay that needs to happen. But you also want to make sure that you have a legal perspective involved. So whether that's your internal GC or an external employment law counsel, you want them on board and in the loop from the beginning, so that anything that you're sending across to folks is also privileged, and you can take the actions that you need to take for any corrective measures with their guidance, and with that all the materials being covered under privilege.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you have the data, you have all your documentation, that you need to understand the compensation story, and then you get the right people involved in this process. And then you can get started, right? So how do we actually conduct an internal pay audit?
Yeah, so depending on the size of a company, it's probably going to look different. If for smaller companies that many open comp clients, it's going to look probably closer to that of a cohort analysis or a average pay ratio analysis. So cohort analysis are where you take a look at a group of employees that have the same job level, and you might have to manually comb through those and just take a look at the differences that you're seeing there. And that's just because there isn't anything statistically relevant there that would lend itself to a larger regression analysis. But ideally, if you have the number of employees to do a regression analysis, that's the path you're going to take. And usually, it's highly technical, so a lot of times that might have to be outsourced by companies, but a regression analysis is the most legally defensible, and that's what a court is probably going to ask for if they do. And so a lot of companies might choose to take that route. And then I touched on it briefly, but kind of that mid-range, if you have a good number of folks in most of your roles and most of your levels to where that you can actually do an analysis of like average pay ratios to where you could see that X female is paid 20% lower than the average male pay there. Let's dig into that. Then that's where you're also going to look at. And that's when you take, again, that all employees by their range and do that compa ratio evaluation and then take averages by gender there.
And you mentioned that the regression analysis is mainly used by larger companies. So what is kind of that minimum threshold on employee for that regression analysis to be done?
I would say you'd probably need employees in the thousands to be able to do that.
Okay, got it. So 1,000 would be the right sample size for that. And then for smaller companies, then you mentioned using the cohort analysis because we're lacking that statistical relevance. And so can we talk a little bit more about what that cohort analysis might look like?
Yeah, so it's really grouping roles that are the same. So maybe all of your software engineers that are a level 4 together, and then comparing them to the pay range that they should be paid against, and understanding who is paid less than others, and can those differences be explained by justifiable reasons. So yeah, that's kind of how you look at that.
Got it. That makes sense. And you mentioned earlier that that can, sometimes be a manual process where you pull together a spreadsheet and you go row by row comparing employee to peer employee. But as pay equity comes to more of the forefront of conversations, there's definitely a better way to do this. So can we talk a little bit about OpenComp's approach for how we help companies conduct pay equity analysis?
Yeah, so first and foremost, we're focused on getting reputable data into the hands of employers so that they can make good decisions around pay, right? And we want that to be better than the candidate asked for this, so this is what we're going to give them. We want it to be, this is what this job is worth in the market. This is our philosophy around comp and how we want to pay. And then this is the offer that we feel we're going to go forward with. And whether a company chooses to negotiate or not, that can be up to them and their compensation philosophy. But if you do choose to negotiate, I would say make sure that you're documenting and being consistent with your reasons why you might choose to bump an offer up or not. But that's first and foremost data, right? You're basing all of your decisions off of market data and how you want to approach it. So you want good data. We also have a DE&I element within our platform to where it takes a look at all of these employees that are benchmarked to this market data or our market data, and then you can see the average pay across genders, ethnicity, etc. So it really takes a lot of that analysis that you might be having to set up in a spreadsheet and puts it into a platform to where you just get down to the actions. Okay, X person is 15% below the target for that role and our comp philosophy. Let's dig into that and understand why. And so ideally that's helping an employer really make some fair, equitable decisions so that an employee doesn't always have to be second guessing or trying to figure out what the best offer is for themselves. Hopefully it lends itself to a more proactive approach from a company perspective.
Thank you for that. And with the automation, but also innovation as well, around how you look at pay, this helps kind of inform how we gather insights from our analysis. And like you said, that's the entire point of doing the analysis in the first place is, keeping your finger on the pulse, getting a sense of what is going on in the employee landscape and ensuring that you're making fair pay decisions. So once you've done, the work of completing this pay audit, what should companies be doing with these insights?
So ideally making any adjustments that you need. So you're probably going to be doing a cost analysis on what can we afford, or what do we need to do, what can we afford to do, and how do we do some of that or all of it, or get people there over time. Usually with this cost analysis, it'll roll up into a budget that you have ideally set between your finance team and yourself. So it goes back to what you can afford. Some companies can do everything and get people up to where they need to be. Some companies have to take a couple cycles to get employees up to where they need to be. And so that ultimately will depend on the company and its financial goals.
Yeah,
But I'd always say with that, I would always say with that to think about working with like what is acceptable as far as getting people in line, or what's kind of a threshold that we'd want to try to meet. And I'd say work with your legal counsel on that one.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I was going to add that, it seems like a common sort of comment or, potentially an underlying fear as to why some organizations don't, start down the pay equity path. But the idea that, if you discover that there is an issue, that you have to immediately fix it, or maybe kind of going back to the old, adage that ignorance is bliss. But I think that there's, definitely some unfounded reasons why companies don't begin looking at internal pay equity. And as we've talked about before, the earlier you look at internal pay equity, the better, because you know what's going on, and you can make changes along the way versus, making a whole slew of inaccurate or poor decisions that you then have to correct at a later date. Have you heard, or I guess can you share any other concerns that maybe are common among clients in regards to fears around performing a pay equity audit?
I think it's just kind of almost like procrastination that anybody would, that we have, normal humans have on a day-to-day basis, right? Like, oh gosh, I don't know what I'm going to find. I don't know how hard of a job it's going to be, what offshoots are going to occur. So I think the first step is understanding the data and getting into it and understanding where your gaps are. Then you can start to approach things with a solution, like a solution mindset. But I think it probably revolves around, they just don't know what's under the hood. But the first step is of course just figuring that out. So
Yeah, and like with what you said earlier, there's not necessarily that expectation that you need to make all the changes all at one time. There still needs to be that financial affordability aspect, but when then you can put a game plan in place for how to fix it, and that's where your legal counsel can, help identify that plan.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're talking a lot about pay transparency in the market as well, and how pay transparency can actually support our pay equity mission from the start. For example, when we list out pay ranges on job postings, maybe when we share more about our compensation philosophy, during the offer process, or when we're trying to woo candidates. But what does transparency typically look like either during or after a pay equity analysis? I guess the question being that should employers share with their team members that they are doing these internal pay equity reviews?
We'll tell employees that yes, they do conduct them, because I do think that is a good message to employees. Like, yeah, we do consider this, and we make it a point to spend the resources, the time, to complete that and make sure that we're paying equitably. Now, the level of transparency that occurs with the results or the actions probably varies company to company, right? You'll notice that most companies out there, the larger companies that do report on their gender pay gaps, are probably at a 1-to-1 or 99-to-1 ratio on cents to the dollar for every male female. So they have really good results to share, and therefore they're like, yes, let's do that, right? But then the some companies might not have the best results, and so they try to keep them internally. And then same thing with communication. Some companies want to just roll in any adjustments into like, here's your new pay rate, or here's your new salary, based on from our compensation planning process. And they might not note that it was a part of it might have been attributed to closing a pay gap. So I think you can go that way, but most companies choose to just roll it into a compensation review discussion, unless you're not doing it in the same cycle, right? And then you have to set some companies do say, hey, we're doing an out of cycle increase for you. We did a broader company wide audit, and this was this came out of results of that. And it ideally isn't just you, right? That's getting this increase. We're making adjustments throughout the company. So that's usually the variations of pay transparency that we see there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in my experience, that's how I've handled it also, in these individual compensation and performance conversations with employees, being able to talk one-on-one about compensation decisions and why they're made, and really frame it in a positive light for the employee, in terms of their value at the organization, and the desire to maintain the relationship for the long term. So I do think that, transparency in a way that is right for your organization can go a long way, and it is a really important piece of all of this to consider.
Yeah, 100%.
Now, we've talked mostly about point-in-time pay equity audits, so, kind of like the more programmatic application of them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's also practices that companies should be considering on a regular basis, on like the day-to-day, so that they can set their companies up for sustainable pay equity success. From your experience and your recommendations, how do companies make the proper pay decisions in real time, so that they reduce any potential friction that could be identified during an audit?
Practices that go that are consistent are ideally having some guidelines around how to go to offer, how to hire, where to hire in the range, how to consider promotions. So having guidelines around all of your processes, or programs, is going to help with decision making, right? And kind of mitigate hopefully some of those erroneous decisions that could creep in there. A lot of companies also choose to remove negotiations from their offer process, so that there isn't kind of like that whoever asks for more gets it. And then transparency, the more transparent you are, kind of the more you're held accountable, right? And so, and the more you really think about speaking to your programs and processes, and so that holds you accountable. So, so those are kind of the things that we see on a regular basis on how people bring it in. But then there's also, again, just making sure that that's ongoing. It's not just, oh, I fixed that then, and now I'm free to go about my business. This is really something that you have to kind of live and breathe through your day in and day out decisions, processes, and then on an annual basis through your planning processes.
Yeah, and that definitely makes sense based on, especially the current state of the market, where, it's highly competitive. The market is, changing what it feels like every day. And, there's definitely a lot going on there. Compensation in general, it's not a one and done, and it's something where you have to always keep your finger on that compensation pulse. And for me, I'm a huge advocate of making compensation decisions that assess not only the external benchmarks, but also the internal benchmarks. Taking a look at peers, understanding how compensation, decisions may affect the stability and the structure of the current team. Taking into consideration, whether the narrative is right and justified, like you said earlier. So, definitely being able to check that box on assessing internal benchmarks for every compensation decision that is made, because every comp decision is going to change just the general makeup and the position to market of your entire organization. So I think that piece is something that can be implemented on in real life every day, every comp decision sort of basis. And for me, I've definitely seen it set me personally as well as my customers up for success when they include that as a best practice.
Yeah, 100. Yeah, totally agree.
Awesome. Well, Julia, thank you so much for being here today, and we'll definitely have you back for an AMA soon.
Looking forward to it. Happy to be here. I'm glad we could talk today about such an important topic and conversation. So,
and next time we'll do it so we can see each other's faces.
yeah, that too. All
Awesome.
right.
Well, and
Bye.
big thank you to our awesome community. Please keep sharing your topic requests because we just love curating content for you. And we'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye.